O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his mercy endures forever. Welcome back to another episode of Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. This is a Catholic variety program broadcasting out here on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio in Jackson, Michigan. And I am your host, Phillip Campbell. I'm going to be spending the next half hour with you chatting about things pertinent to the Catholic faith. Could be theology, could be history, could be music, could be art, could be anything. That's what we talk about on Faith Matters. But today we're going to talk about history, which is one of my favorite subjects because, full disclosure, I'm a history teacher. I'm an author of several history books. Story of Civilization series from Tan Books is probably what I'm most known for. So we're going to talk about the history of a very important country today. Have you ever heard the phrase "the Church's eldest daughter"? This refers to a country, the Church's eldest daughter. What country is the Church's eldest daughter? I'll give you a few moments. Any guesses? The Church's eldest daughter is France. France is the Church's eldest daughter. This was a nickname given to the Kingdom of France in the Middle Ages. Why is this? Well, we know that Christianity originally sprouted in the social milieu of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire at its height covered all of Europe. It covered North Africa. It covered Asia Minor and the Middle East, what is now Lebanon, Syria, Palestine. It even went into parts of Iraq and Armenia. So this vast polity known as the Roman Empire was the political power when the church was founded, and it was entirely pagan. Now, of course, as Christianity grew over the centuries, the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, and it was replaced by several barbarian kingdoms that occupied the territory that the Roman Empire used to occupy. So you had the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, or the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, or the kingdom of the Franks in what is now France, the Anglo-Saxons in England, and so on and so forth. France is known as the Church's eldest daughter because it was the region of France that was the first kingdom in the territory of the old Roman Empire to convert and to embrace Orthodox Christianity. And what we're going to talk about in today's program is the history of how France became Christian. Now, France in the old days, in the time of the Roman Empire, was once known as Gaul. And it was named Gaul because of the inhabitants, the Gauls. The Gauls were a Celtic people who came to the region sometime in the middle of the first millennium BC, and the Romans had various contact with them over the years. The Gauls had sacked Rome in the 4th century BC, and they were always on the border of the Roman Empire, kind of raiding or ready to take advantage of weaknesses in Rome's defenses, until the time of Julius Caesar, when Julius Caesar, in the middle of the 1st century BC, marched up into Gaul with the Roman legions and one by one subjugated the Gallic tribes, forced them into a position of Roman subjects, organized the territory as a series of Roman provinces, and brought the entire what is now the country of France, and really Belgium and the Netherlands as well, and Switzerland, into the sphere of Roman authority. And so, for most of the history of the Roman Empire, the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Gaul was a very peaceful place. It was one of the better administered Roman territories. You didn't have a lot of problems up there in Gaul. It was an ideal place, and Roman culture and civilization really blossomed in Gaul. To this day, in places like Marseille or even in Paris, you can still see the ruins from the centuries when this was a Roman province. Now, Christianity came to Gaul in the 2nd century AD through the port city of Marseille. Marseille is the very south of France on the Mediterranean coast. It was there that Christianity first entered Gaul from Greek missionaries, and also from there it went into the southern metropolis of Lyon. In the late 2nd century, one of the most eminent clergyman in Gaul is Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. He was a Greek living in the city of Lyon, and that was really the Christian demographic in Gaul at this time. It was largely made up of Greek expatriates from the Eastern Empire who were coming west for the purpose of spreading the Christian faith and spread it primarily among Greek-speaking communities. And so Christianity spread without too much incident throughout Gaul through the 2nd and 3rd century, and such that the territory was fairly Christianized by the time we get to the 4th century. So, for example, in the early 4th century, the Roman governor there, Constantius Chlorus, who was directly appointed by the Emperor Diocletian, was married to a Christian wife, Saint Helena. So Christian society there in Gaul was well enough established that even in pagan times, you had a Christian woman married to the governor. So Christianity had made significant advances in Gaul, and in the year 303, when the pagan emperor Diocletian began the great persecution against the church, this was the church's biggest persecution of the Roman period. It lasted 10 years, and many of the martyrs we commemorate in the Mass and mentioned in the Roman canon were killed during this period, like Saint Sebastian and so on. But when Diocletian instituted this persecution, the governor of the West, Constantius Chlorus, essentially refused to enforce it. He was married to a Christian. There was so many Christians in Gaul, in his territory, it was going to be entirely unenforceable. And so, like any good political ruler when faced with an unjust edict, Constantius Chlorus just chose to ignore the decree of persecution and let the persecution lapse in Gaul. So by and large, the Christians of Gaul were able to escape the Roman persecution. Well, eventually the persecution ended, and the son of Constantius Chlorus, Constantine, after a brief civil war, came to power in the West. And Constantine is probably best known as being the first Christian Roman Empire. In the year 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, which officially ended the Great Persecution, but more importantly, it declared that Christianity was now a legal, recognized religion in the Roman Empire. It was guaranteed certain legal protections. Christians could no longer be persecuted, could no longer have their property seized. It was set up alongside all the other pagan religions as a belief system that enjoyed the official protection of the government. And this also begins the Christian era of the Roman Empire, the late Roman Empire, when Rome starts to embrace Christianity. Now, throughout the 4th century, we see a real flowering of Catholic culture in Gaul as the church is able to come out of the shadows. You have these great figures like Saint Hilary of Poitiers, who is one of the greatest theologians in the West in the early 4th century. And then he's followed by probably one of the greatest saints in Western history, who's Saint Martin of Tours. Martin is famously depicted in the church's hagiographical tradition as you might see him on horseback with a red cloak, cutting his cloak in half to give to a beggar. He was a Roman soldier who converted and left the Roman military to embrace monastic life. And as the story goes, he once cut his cloak in half and gave it to a beggar that he met on the road to Amiens. St. Martin founded monasteries throughout the south of France. The famous monastery of Marmoutier, where St. Patrick, the great St. Patrick of Ireland, would come to study during the end of Martin's life. So there was just this great flowering of monasticism and scholarship, and just very well-organized, disciplined church, reputation for orthodoxy. When the Pelagian heresy struck the church in the late 4th century going to the 5th century, it was the theologians and bishops of Gaul who responded with the greatest zeal. Pelagianism was the heresy that said that we did not need God's grace to get to heaven. We could get to heaven by our own works. And that was that was fiercely contested by the bishops of Gaul, especially Prosper of Aquitaine. So, in this time period, the last century of the Roman Empire, there's just this great flowering of Catholic intellectual life in southern Gaul. However, things were about to drastically change in the territory with the coming of the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic tribe. They'd come out of the east in what is now northern Germany, and they were pagans. And during the end of the Roman Empire, you had all these tribes, these Germanic tribes who history has unflatteringly called the barbarians, who came flooding across the boundaries into the empire. The Franks were pagans, as I said, and began moving into Gaul in the north, beginning in a little trickle around 300, but then as the centuries wore on, they started coming in greater numbers and slowly began taking over northern Gaul as the Roman Empire collapsed. And they settled all throughout the regions around what are now Belgium and Paris and Normandy. These were the regions that fell under the influence of the Gauls, and they essentially set up their own kingdom up there. And after the Roman Empire would collapse, they would be the de facto authority in the area. Not that the Franks and the Romans were necessarily enemies. In fact, the Romans and the Franks fought together against Attila the Hun in the year 451 at the great Battle of Chalon, when Attila brought his Hunnic army into Gaul and attempted to dislodge the Western Roman Empire, and he was defeated by a coalition of Goths, Franks, and Romans. Now, one of the heroes of that battle against Attila was a Frankish warlord named Merovec. And Merovec was a chieftain who won great glory at this battle against Attila, and he became one of the dominant Frankish figures in the north. Now, a few years after Attila was defeated in the year 476, the Western Roman Empire fell. Rome was done, in the West at least. You had a couple of Roman governors hanging on to authority throughout the West, but by and large the empire was done. And the Franks were still ruling Gaul in the north. By this time they were being ruled by Clovis, who was the grandson of Merovec. Merovec, his dynasty was called the Merovingians after Merovec, and Clovis was the ruler of the Merovingian dynasty. So you have this powerful pagan Frankish kingdom in northern Gaul. You have the end of the Roman Empire, so there's a power vacuum. All these tribes are jostling for power. Who's going to come out on top, and where do Christians fall in all of this? Because Gaul, like I said, it had been fairly thoroughly Christianized, especially in the south, but now it was under the dominion of these various pagan tribes. Some of the tribes, like the Visigoths, had embraced Arianism, so you had heretic barbarian tribes to make it worse. So how were things going to play out? Well, Clovis, though a pagan, was no stranger to Christianity. He was married to a Burgundian princess named Clotilda, who was from a Christian family. So his wife was Christian. He knew what Christianity was. He was acquainted with the bishop Saint Remigius of Reims, and Remigius was the confessor to the queen and a friend of the royal family. So Clovis had occasion to learn about Christianity from Remigius. And Clotilda seems to have had some influence on her husband. As she became pregnant with the couple's firstborn son, she convinced Clovis to allow the child to be baptized as a Christian. So it seemed that the royal house may embrace Christianity. Unfortunately, as soon as the child was born and baptized, he very quickly fell ill and died, as often happened back then when infant mortality was much more common. Clovis was furious. He blamed the baptism ritual. He said, "Very fine thing. I have my firstborn son, and I agree to have him baptized, and he dies. That's never going to happen again. I'm never letting you near any of my kids with that creepy holy water again." This was a great source of anxiety to his wife, Clotilda. But Clotilda and Remigius eventually persuaded Clovis, and when she again became pregnant, he consented to allow the second child to be baptized, and this time the son survived, and he would grow up to succeed his father to the throne. Clovis was a very rough around the edges sort of guy. His character is best demonstrated by a story. He had gone to war against one of the last Roman generals in Gaul, Syagrius. Syagrius was defeated, and the Frankish army had pillaged a church and pillaged a lot of the sacred vessels. And the bishop Remigius had come to Clovis and politely asked for the return of these sacred vessels. And in particular, he wanted a specific vase back. Now, we don't know exactly what the vase, this is how it was translated, a vase, but we don't know what exactly this vessel was, but it was some sort of vessel from the church that Clovis's army had pillaged in the city of Soissons. And so Remigius asked the king for the return of the vase. So Clovis went out to his army, and his men were distributing the booty in different piles. And the way the Franks did it was the pile of treasure was basically divided up randomly, and every man received whatever pile fell to him by lot. Clovis saw the vase in one of the treasure piles, and he said, "Please give me that vase. I need to return it to the bishop." But one of the soldiers was angry, and he took an axe and he smashed the vase. Clovis was beside himself. The soldier said to him, "This is not the custom of the Franks. However the treasure is divided by lot, that's who gets it. Whether king or commoner, you don't get to come in and take your pick out of anybody else's pile." Well, Clovis didn't do anything about it right then. He just stewed on it for a while. Later the following year, he was mustering his army for war, and he was reviewing his troops, and he noticed the same man that had smashed the vase. He saw the man who'd broken the vase of Soissons, and he walked up to him, and he started insulting him. He said, "Your uniform's a mess. You look all disheveled. You're a poor excuse for a soldier." And then he grabbed the man's weapon out of his hand and threw it on the ground. The soldier bent down to pick up his weapon, and when he bent down, Clovis drew his battle axe and smashed the skull of the soldier, killing him instantly, and said to him, "Thus you did to the vase of Soissons." "You break my vase, I break your head." That was his way of doing things. So he was a rough around the edges sort of guy. He was not above using duplicity and treachery and murder to obtain what he wanted. On another occasion, he convinced a rival chieftain to rebel against his father and murder his father, and then once the chieftain had murdered his own father, Clovis murdered the chieftain, thus getting rid of the whole family in one fell swoop, and consolidating his power even further. But even a rough around the edges man like Clovis eventually has to come face to face with the fact that he is only mortal and that he is in need of the grace of the living God just as anyone else. And this moment for Clovis came around the year 496. And what was going on in 496 was Clovis by this time had pretty much overrun most of what we now think of as France. There were only a few pockets of resistance holding out against his power, and one of these rival tribes were the Alemanni, who were engaging Clovis in the south. And so Clovis brought his Franks down and engaged them at a battle called the Battle of Tolbiac in the year 496. Well, things did not go very well for the Franks in that battle. They were surrounded. All hope of victory was lost. Clovis was cut off with just a small group of soldiers, and all help seemed in vain. And he called out to his gods. He called out to the gods of the Franks, the Germanic gods, and there was no help. And so finally, in desperation, he called out and said, "Oh, Jesus Christ, God whom my wife worships." Isn't that a nice way to call out to God? God whom my wife worships. The God that Clotilda told me about, whoever you are. I've prayed to my gods in vain. They've not helped me. I'm about to be cut off. If you are who my wife says you are, come to my aid. Give me victory this day over my enemies, and I will worship you and build temples to your honor." And immediately when he had uttered this prayer, the tide of the battle began to turn, imperceptibly at first, but surely enough. The tides turned, and what began as a Frankish rout became a great Frankish victory. Well, Clovis may have been rough around the edges, but he did keep his word. He was convinced of the power of Jesus Christ. He came back from the battle rejoicing and told his wife and St. Remigius that he had decided to embrace the Catholic faith. And so they made joyous celebrations for his baptism in the city of Reims. And the baptism of a king, oh, this is a big deal. The baptism of a king, especially in those days when he's coming from paganism into the Catholic faith. The whole city of Reims was decorated with white banners celebrating the king's baptism. And on the day of his baptism, he came processing down the street with thousands of his Frankish warriors, because the custom among the Germanic tribes was that whatever the king did, his warriors would follow him. If the king died in battle, all the warriors would stay and die in battle. If the king converted to Catholicism, his warriors would convert to Catholicism. They had a very radical personal loyalty to their king and war chief. And so Clovis and these thousands of Frankish lords come processing down the street into the cathedral of Reims. And he comes in, and there is St. Remigius waiting for him at the baptismal font. And Remigius says to him, "Bow your head, O king. Destroy the things you have adored, and adore the things you have destroyed." And so Clovis is baptized, and following him, thousands of his warriors and nobles. There's a great story about the baptism of Clovis. It may be legendary, but it's the story of the San Ampoule, which is the holy oil. And the story goes that on the day of Clovis's baptism, after he'd been baptized, Remigius was prepared to anoint him with the oil of confirmation, but found that somebody had left the holy chrism behind, and there was no oil to be found. And upon realizing there was no holy oil, suddenly a bird, a dove, symbolizing the Holy Spirit, flew into the church with a vial of holy oil in its claws and dropped it into the hands of St. Remigius, from which he anointed the king. This miraculous oil would be buried with Remigius, but it was later, when his relics were moved, the kings of France removed the holy oil, and it was used in every single royal coronation of the kings of France, right down to the period of the French Revolution. At what time the revolutionaries destroyed the vial, as they destroyed all symbols of the old regime and of Catholicism. Some of the holy oil still remains to this day. There's a little bit of it that was saved, but at any rate, a fun story. But so with the baptism of Clovis in the year 496, France, the kingdom of the Franks, will officially enter the Catholic fold. Now, that doesn't mean paganism disappeared overnight, but now Clovis was embracing the Catholic faith. He was willing that his kingdom become Christian, and he very soon noticed that there was many, besides his conviction that Jesus Christ was who Jesus claimed to be, that he's true God and true man, there was a lot of temporal benefits to becoming Christian as well. The most educated men of the realm were the Catholic clergy. And when Clovis suddenly got the support of the Catholic clergy, it gave him access to a lot of the administrative and intellectual skill that he needed to help organize and administer his new kingdom, to help him in the drafting of laws, in the establishment of churches and abbeys, the administration of justice, the collection of revenues. Not that the church itself did these things, but that he was able to tap into the educated class of the clergy to help him set up this governing establishment, to bring order to what was a chaotic barbarian kingdom. How much Clovis ever understood about Christianity, how much he really got it, we don't know. There's a great story that shortly after his conversion, Saint Remigius was explaining the Catholic faith to him, and he was talking about how Jesus Christ was crucified by the Romans. And Clovis got indignant, and he said, "If I was there with my Franks, I would have stopped it. I would have saved him." And we can imagine Remigius rolling his eyes. Of course, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is what makes our salvation possible. Christ wanted to die. That was why he came to earth. And here's Clovis saying, "I would have stopped it if I was there." You can imagine the bishop saying, "Do you understand the religion that you just converted to?" But we start small, right? Faith starts like the size of a mustard seed, and then it grows. And that is, in fact, what happened with the Kingdom of France. Clovis lived on. He reigned for several more years after his conversion. He died in the year 511 after having reigned as a Christian for approximately 15 years. He was succeeded by his sons, who faithfully maintained his father's commitment to making the Kingdom of the Franks into a Christian kingdom. And Christianity would continue to flourish and prosper throughout France as the new kingdom grew. And as France became the most powerful kingdom in the West, eventually the other kingdoms around either also embraced Christianity if they were pagan, like the pagans of Thuringia and Hesse and the Frisians and all these groups in Germany. But also the other groups, the other kingdoms that were Arian, like Visigothic Spain. In the 6th century, their king accepted Catholicism. Eventually, the Arian Ostrogoths were displaced, and they were replaced by a Catholic kingdom in Italy. So eventually, due to the political power, the might, the cultural influence of the Frankish kingdom, all the surrounding territories eventually went the way of the Franks and accepted Catholicism as well. And even going on into the Middle Ages, I mean, when we think about medieval life, France is the cultural center of the West. France was the cultured language of Europe for century upon century. The great literature of the Middle Ages, of the troubadours, of the romances, of the chivalric epics, these all came originally out of France. France was the center of Catholic culture, the heart of Catholic identity in Western Europe. And so that is the story of how we got that way. That is why France is called the Church's eldest daughter. So, hopefully we'll have time in future episodes to explore more stories like this of how the faith spread and of the great men and women like St. Clotilda or St. Remigius who made these things possible. But that will have to wait until another day. So until next time, friends, this has been Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless you.